Hello and welcome to a very special How I Paint Things. So special, in fact, it's actually quite difficult to get this entire tank in the shot so I can show you what we're doing today. Now, ambush pattern camouflage was designed to replicate the effect of light filtering through a canopy. So you could park a tank under a copse of trees or near some hedges or what have you, and these little dappled spots were supposed to accurately reflect how light would act in that situation. We'll talk a little more about that in a second. Now, this is actually way more simple to do than I had expected. It is time consuming, but I wanted to do another method which didn't feature an airbrush. I think if you have got your hands on an airbrush, you are going to find it leagues simpler to lay down your camo pattern with that, but much of a much. I think if you want to just have some fun and paint, this does not look too bad. So all of the paints will be listed in the description below, and being Vallejo this time, I am going to make sure that they also include their number codes. Let's get started. Now, before we get started on the painting, we actually have to have a little bit of a history lesson, which starts, get this, with a physics lesson. Now, there is an interesting phenomenon in painting which is called scale fade. You might have heard of it. And the premise of this is basically the smaller a figure is, the lighter you have to paint it. Now, I had heard this a lot, and if you've ever gone from painting 28mm figures to 15 or 10, you might have experienced this yourself and thought, well, why do my figures look so dark when I'm using the same colors? And the reason for this is rooted in physics, specifically how light reacts to smaller things. In essence, because there is less surface area of a miniature for the light to actually reflect to our eyes from, we see a darker color. The smaller it is, it catches less light, we see less light, the color looks dark. That's bonkers. So what it means is when we're painting smaller figures, we need to use lighter colors. And that's where dunkelgelb comes in. Now, dunkelgelb, literally dark yellow in German, refers to, well, this sort of color. And you will find some pretty staunch debate on the subject of what exactly dunkelgelb looked like. Now, I've used here a primer from Vallejo. This is literally their desert yellow, and to my eye, it makes a pretty good dunkelgelb at this scale, particularly because we are going to shade it. Now, I mention this because if you want a lighter dunkelgelb, now I've seen a lot of artwork and some restorations of Panthers that have quite light dunkelgelb by comparison. If you want to replicate that, green ochre is a place to start. Start from a mid-tone yellow or beige or something, even skeleton bone, and then a couple of coats of green ochre. But for our purposes, I'm going to stick to desert yellow. It's going to work just fine. Now, ordinarily you won't see me painting with a glove, but just because of the sheer size of this thing, it makes it a little easier rather than sticking thumbprints over some of these nice flat areas. Now, I realized early on, goodness me, I was telling big porkies, because I'm going to shade this, I actually do want to start from a lighter color. So I've got that green ochre here. Nice big brush, and you'll see this covers fairly well. So I'm just going to go over the whole tank. I will probably need to come back and give it a second coat just to get a nice solid color, but this is not particularly taxing. So, now the wonderful thing about the running gear on these things is that the wheels themselves ordinarily weren't camouflaged. So once you've got them colored the way that you want, pop your glove on and you've got a perfect place to hold this thing while you work. Now, much like Feldgrau, dunkelgelb, if someone tries to tell you that you've got the wrong color, you just kick them in the shins. And on that subject, I've got here a couple of colors that I was thinking about using for the camo stripes, the red stuff. Well, the brown, rather. Now, in most images, you're going to see there's a mid-tone sort of brown, but it has a slight reddish quality to it. So for that reason, I'm going to use saddle brown, which is this sausage here, which has a little bit of red to it. It will look more red going on, but again, once we shade this, it's going to bring that down and look more dark in comparison. If you want a quote-unquote correct answer, German camo medium brown, which is a name and a half, that would be essentially the right answer, but I think when we shade it, that's going to look quite a bit darker than it should. So tiny fraction of brown suits me just fine. Now you'll see I've got one of my little makeup brushes here, and this is going to serve us extremely well. I'm going to scrub most of my paint off onto a bit of kitchen towel here. I might have taken a little bit too much off there. And pick an area where I want to apply that camo pattern. So the front plate here is a pretty good spot. And I'm just going to start little sort of semicircular passes with my brush. Now you'll see it takes a few seconds to build up the color in one area, but by using a soft brush and dry brushing this on, we can get a fairly soft edge to some of these patterns, which kind of replicates an airbrush. It's not going to be perfect, but it will be pretty close. So here comes the fun part. I find it's really useful if you've got a reference image you can work from. You can, of course, make up your own camo patterns, but why do the legwork, you know? History has plenty of examples for us. So I'm going to lightly dab down, you know, in some of the areas where I know I'm going to put this. So along the colors here, equipment and stuff, just paint straight over it. Now I'll tell you from experience, be very careful with these front machine guns. The number of times I've knocked these bleeding things off while I'm painting, eh? But however you do it, I am going to go around now, fill in the camo pattern on this. And remember as well that you do have a turret. But on these designs, you'll find that the turret and the tank itself don't always match up. So you can paint them separately and not worry about the camo lining up with one another. Now, while I'm feathering these, a good example is going to be this line here. You see, I've sort of just botted it out to get an idea of what shape I want. Now what I'm going to do is start sort of scrubbing little circular motions, just dry brushing on that feathered edge with very little paint on my brush. So it starts to look a bit more natural. Well, natural as though it was applied with an airbrush. Now that'll take a bit of doing, and it will need some practice, so grab yourself a piece of cardboard and prime that to have a play around if you're not confident that you're going to get the edge that you want. If you do end up with a slightly fuzzier edge than you'd like, and you'd like to tidy it up, just grab yourself a smaller brush, and I am going to very lightly just scrub towards the edges with a little bit of paint on my brush. And you'll see this takes a while, but it gives us a nice irregular edge. A spot like here is a good example. You see where I haven't really got quite the amount of paint I'd like in that gap. So I'm going to pass around it just a couple of times to essentially fix that not quite airbrushed look. Now this is probably the time-consuming part, but it is well worth doing because if you finish it right, this will look really cool. Now in some areas I've gone a little overboard, but that's not a problem. I can tidy that up with my green stage. And you'll see some of these areas aren't feathered quite as nicely as I'd like. But again, when I'm finished with the green, I can come back and bring the green ochre, that lovely yellow color, and feather my edges with that. But our reward for having finished all of that brown is now to bust out, let's pop the turret off again, some retractive or reflective or refractive green. The name on this seems to change almost at random. And I'm going to do the same thing with another dry brush. It's very important that your brush is dry. Can't specify that enough. And let's just go around now and do the same thing again with green. I'll make sure that I include the bottle code, so the number for this green, because the name is probably not going to help you if you go looking for this. But here we go again. Now in the case of the green, I did have to come back and do another layer over the top. But once I'd gotten the soft edge the way I wanted, I just used a normal brush and sort of avoided those edges, just to block in that color. There are one or two areas where things are a little bit more scrubby than I'd like. So I've got some of that wonderful green ochre again, and I'm going to just lightly, with a very small brush, just nudge in and sort of chill out some of those edges. At this point, it would also be worth going over any areas where you have, hit the running gear. So what have you got to do now? Let's just tidy up with some green ochre. Now, while we've got out the green ochre, or whatever color you used for the base coat of your Dunkelgelb. Grab yourself an ordinary brush, and here we go. We're going to start just blip, 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 and so on through all of the red and green areas. Now, don't worry if these aren't exactly the same size. I've seen some very strange suggestions on what sort of tools you should use for this, including a cat's whisker, which I cannot source nor recommend from experience, but away we go. Try not to thin your paint out before you get to this stage, because otherwise you're going to be painting forever. And then onto the green. So, this is one of those weird situations where ordinarily I hate to say less is more. So instead I'll say less will probably look a little better. But however many you choose, if you're working from an existing color scheme or what have you, it's time to paint some dots. Now once you find your flow, that's actually not too bad. It doesn't take very long and it's not as mind-numbing as you might expect. What I've got now, let's go back to the green and, oh, here we go. Green dots on the yellow bits. Now I've seen some folks who will go to the lengths of putting the green dots into the brown and the brown dots into the green and really crossing it over. I don't think that's necessary. A few of the color schemes I've seen don't go to that length, and I mean sort of real ones. So it is up to you if you want to really go to town in that respect, but I'm not going to. I'm just going to stick to the yellow and the green and save myself the time. Now that's the hard part done. What I'm going to do now is take them outside and give them a spray of a gloss varnish. This is important because of how I'm going to shade it. I don't want to do a huge all-over shade. I'm going to do what's called a pin wash. Now, if you are going ahead and you're going to use an oil-based product for this, you've got enamels that you want to do your pin wash with, you definitely want to use a gloss varnish because it will protect the work that you've already done. If you are going to use an acrylic like I am, it's still good practice because the gloss varnish will help the capillary action. Again, physics lessons. And that's going to help that shade flow only into the recesses where I want to apply it. So once I've applied the varnish, it needs to sit and cure for about half an hour. So let's go take this sucker outside and get them nice and glossy. Now I've given that about 40 minutes to cure just to be safe, and it's pretty shiny. Not to worry, we are going to matte varnish that in a couple of minutes. Now, a pin wash refers to taking a brush in whatever shade mix you're using and just painting it into the lines of detail. This can be quite time consuming, but it does look pretty cool when you're done. However, I've reached the point where I'm incredibly lazy and I want to get this bleeding thing painted. So what I'm going to do is to crack out my magic 1-to-1 strong tone and quick shade mixing medium and a big boy brush. And I'm going to apply this over the whole model. Now I've used the medium in this case because I want a slightly sort of thinned out shading effect. If I were to use straight strong tone, this would be very dark. But you'll see even when just bopping it over the top of these areas of detail, it kind of naturally heads towards, what's the word? Recesses and areas of detail that you do want shaded. Now when you come to big flat areas, like on the hull here, or on the sides of the turret, for example, once you've applied it, just give it a couple of seconds to collect, and then you can start drawing it away from flat areas like so. And I'm going to paint in the whole hull and the turret, the whole tank, using this mix. Now you could use straight strong tone or Agrax Earthshade or anything of the like, but I think something thinned out will give you a slightly better finish. I don't want to darken my tank too much. Now as you're working on flat areas like the hull here, you're going to find that you do end up with some tide marks. But before your shade dries completely, what you can do is, with a little bit of shade still on your brush here, just lightly, oops, that might be a bit much, lightly drag down quick straight lines and you'll soften that up and you'll get kind of a rough, almost rain effect on the tank itself. Now it's not perfect, but it does get rid of the worst of the shade dribbles that you're going to have, and it can be used to create just a little bit of variation in color. Once we've finished weathering and shading, the rest of the tank, all the other stuff will do, you won't notice it. So here, for example, on these panels, let's just quickly, starting from the back, flick, 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 flick. There we go. Our shading is intact, but we don't have big tide marks on flat areas. Now, after plenty of time to dry, you'll have something that looks like this. Now, because of the way that that will dry, especially over the gloss varnish, you're going to get some funny patchy looking areas. Hold the faith, we are going to fix that. What I've got now is some dark sand rather. And I'm going to put this down for a second because I want to work this into a big soft dry brush. And you really want to make sure you are leaving almost nothing behind when you finish with this, because we're going to dry brush very lightly all of the edges of the vehicle. So along the skirts here, we'll just lightly flick along the edge and catch that and get a nice sharp edge to everything. Now this works perfectly well over the green and the brown as well. And once you've got the right amount sort of coming off your brush, head round and lightly dry brush all of these areas where something is sticking up from the hull. What I'm going to do now is apply my decals. And I'm doing this because there's still a bit of a gloss finish. I'm not going crazy, I'm just going to apply turret markings and a couple of Balkenkreuz. But yeah, I've got them on a bit of kitchen towel here. Reason being I can dampen this down and then basically leave them in place until I'm ready to work with them. And then once they're ready to apply, I can pick them up and just slide them into place on the middle. Slide them casually into place. Now once those have had about 20 minutes to dry and set properly, I'm going to take this bad boy outside and hit it with a matte varnish. Now we're going to do that now rather than as a final stage, because matting the texture is going to make it much easier to apply black and the weathering details we're going to add. So let's go ahead and do that now. Now we're starting to look a little more reasonable. I should have waited a wee bit longer to varnish this because I've got a little bit of shine still on my decals, but I'm going to wait and I'll fix that up. It's not a problem. What I've got now is some black, and I'm just going to mix a little bit of water into this, and using a flat brush, let's flick this bad boy open. You see, I don't paint the underside. Who's looking at the underside? Let's just fill in the black areas. And you can use this as well on the MG and what have you. When you come to areas that are a little harder to reach, just swap on down to a normal, smaller brush. Now, one detail of note with the Panther is that it did have black rings on its road wheels, which is a pain in the proverbial to paint, but it does look cool as hell when it's done. So do take the time. Any mistakes, you can come back with a little bit of dark sand to just blip in the edges of the rings again. Now you see what I mean? That does look way cooler, right? Now the wheels behind would also have had black rims, but honestly, by the time we're finished, you're never going to see them. So save yourself the injury and don't bother. What I've got here is oily steel, and we're going to overbrush this quite lightly onto the tracks. So again, we're not worried about the bits we're not going to see, but just lightly flicking to catch raised areas of detail. And then once you've done a couple of passes of that, just using the side of a flat brush, you can flick down the sides here too. That picks that out quite quickly. Don't forget these tracks on the side of the hull here, like I did. Now, oily steel is actually a really nice color because you apply it in one coat and you'll get a kind of dark semi-satin finish with that. But you come back and give it a second coat and you get a really shiny metal. It's a brilliant color. Anyhow, I've got flat brown and I'm going to finish painting in any wooden details. And from here on in, we can weather the vehicle like I normally would. So I've got a little bit of packing foam bunched up into a little wad. And I have some German camo black-brown here. And we're going to lay down just a few little dots along areas which would likely see a lot of travel. So up along here, along where the crew are likely to climb, put some chips. And this is one stage where you can go overboard. With all the work we've done so far, it would be preferable not to. So take your time and sort of, look away from your work every now and then just to get a feel for how much is actually being left. But once you're satisfied with this, we can move on to making up our track wash. Now for this, I've got some red leather on my palette over here, and I'm going to mix this up with a bunch of water till the point it doesn't even really resemble paint anymore. You should start to see your palette coming through underneath. And once you've got plenty of that water in there, just apply this fairly generously over your tracks. Now once that's dried, you'll see that's quite a lot more subtle than it looks going on. So quite a lot better, I would say. What we'll do now is exactly the same thing again, except I'm using the color brown sand. And I want to water this down, honestly, even more than the red leather, to the point I've basically got mush. And we're going to use this as a dust filter. So let's grab our tanker here, and we'll start just blobbing this fairly generously and haphazardly all over the tank. Now when you get to areas like the front here, what we're going to do is just splatter it fairly randomly and guide it to corners where I want it to collect. I keep twanging that barrel. I'm quite nervous about that. Anyhow, this is a lot of fun. So I'm going to basically dust up the whole tank, and we'll come back and have a look once this is dried. And there we have it. At last, our ambush camouflage Panther is complete. Now, there is actually a product from Vallejo that you can use for that dust effect. It looks pretty cool too, but you can just as easily mix up a paint with some water and make it yourself. Now ordinarily this is the stage where I say this was a lot of fun. It was a little more time consuming than I had planned. This is now the longest it's ever taken me to record a How I Paint thing. So if you did enjoy this, or if you find it useful, I'd really appreciate just drop a thumbs up and a comment. Say hi. I don't often ask, hey, say hi, but why not? So as always, thank you very much to Exit 23 Games for the light and sound equipment, as well as all of the lovely patrons who are keeping me ticking in paints and glue, including producers Alan Nuttall, Kyrie Crawford, Trainboy, Fred, and Jimmy. So I've got another producer. Hi, Jimmy. And folks, your support is invaluable. Now, if you've got any questions or comments, of course, feel free, drop them in the old box below. My Twitter and Instagram are now linked there too. So thank you very much for your time, one and all, and you all enjoy the rest of your day.